In today's lesson's background, we see that the people of Israel who had wandered in the desert for 40 years were now completely settled in the Promised Land. They had recently transitioned from a period when judges ruled to a new stage of governance where they had a king to rule over them like other nations. However, the king was not to be like other kings. The Lord was still the king, which meant that Israel was still very much a theocratic nation governed by God. Although David could not build the temple himself, he prepared everything his son needed. Which brings us to our key verse for today, which reads, "You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. You have made that promise with your own mouth, and with your own hands you have fulfilled it today." 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 15. Solomon's prayer of dedication is said to be one of the most beautiful passages in the Bible. His proclamation that there is no God like thee must be seen not only as an absolute truth based on the relationship with God, but also as an indictment of the surrounding nations who worshipped pagan gods. There is no God like the Lord, and the God of Israel was the only God in heaven and earth. This praise is followed by three important theological words: keep, covenant, and mercy. The verb shamar means to keep, observe, guard, or even to be a watchman. In the sentence, shamar highlights an attribute inherent to divine nature. God is and will always be the kind who keeps covenant. And mercy. Steadfast love, or mercy here, chesed, is the emblematic quality of the covenant relationship, a quality of God and required of his covenant partners. Solomon directly references the covenantal provision made with David. In it, the terms governing both parties are highlighted. God would establish the Davidic throne forever. Jesus was the fulfillment of that. The people were expected to take heed to their way and live according to divine standards. The Hebrew word translated take heed is the same shamar used to show how God keeps his side of the covenant. The people of Israel are to be just as devoted to keeping the covenant as God is. In so doing, they are to walk in his law. This is a very common word in the Old Testament and can refer to physical walking or how a life is lived. David gave his people an example of how to walk as he walked. Same Hebrew, before God. This points to the heavy burden of role modeling and accountability for pastors and leaders today. In verse 18, Solomon realized a theological truth that David might not have fully realized. God could not be contained in any building or structure. The prophet Isaiah later comments in a vision that just the train of God's robe fills the temple grounds in Isaiah 6 verse 1. The point of the temple was not to house the deity, but to provide a special place to remember his name. It was a point of connection between earth and God's heavenly abode. The temple was a physical structure where the people could offer sacrifice and pray. However, God's presence was not to be reduced to or confined to the temple. God is transcendent, which means above all. Solomon uses the term heaven of heavens, which is the Hebrew way of doubling to show a superlative, like the holy of holies. Heaven of heavens refers to another heaven above the normal. It might mean where God and his angels live as opposed to heaven, which is basically the sky and space where the sun, moon, and stars are. Alternately, Solomon could just be describing the poetic awe of God's majesty. Solomon asked God to incline his ear toward the king and the people when they prayed from the temple. The overall tone of what he prays reflects his awareness of his sinfulness and that of the nation before the God of Israel, who is gracious. Since the temple would be the place where sacrifices are offered, Israel would need God's acceptance of those sacrifices and his forgiveness of their sins. He ends the prayer with a request for God to forgive. So here's our lesson. The concept of forgiveness of sins is central to Judeo-Christian theology. Throughout the Old Testament, God is the only person ever seen as the subject of the verb salak. Only God grants forgiveness. To be forgiven, first the sinner must confess their sin, make atonement, and ask for forgiveness. Once these steps are completed, God is full of graciousness and mercy, and God will forgive, bringing us back into community with himself and fellow believers, and restoring us the blessing.